What single human has done the most damage to the progression of humanity in the history of mankind? Guy de Chauliac. He was a surgeon in the 1300s who vehemently spoke out against another fellow surgeon, Theodoric Borgognoni. Theodoric was a surgeon who wrote about his theories on proper wound care and believed that the best thing you can do to a wound is wrap it and keep it clean. Guy hated what Theodoric was writing because it directly went against the teachings of Galen, an ancient Greek surgeon who believed pus was the body's way of balancing your humors. Guy's teachings were widely accepted, and it's believed that his ignorance set the development of antisepsis in surgery back about 600 years. Guy de Chauliac was born in the 1300s, not 1200s, as he was alive during the Black Death. Ignaz Semmelweis was the guy who was thrown into a mental asylum for saying surgeons should wash their hands between seeing patients. There was also a French physician who discovered some valuable kinds of anesthetics but was ignored by the medical community because he couldn't write in Latin. His name was Ambroise Paré. From Wikipedia, Paré discovered that the soldiers treated with the boiling oil were in agony, whereas the ones treated with the ointment had recovered because of the antiseptic properties of turpentine. This proved this method's efficacy, and he avoided cauterization thereafter. However, treatments such as this were not widely used until many years later. He published his first book, The Method of Curing Wounds Caused by Arquebus and Firearms, in 1545. Injured soldiers continued to be treated with boiling oil for many years because Paré's discovery was snubbed. It's not totally inaccurate. Back when smallpox was still a thing in India, people noticed that cows, being the larger mammal, had a much higher chance of surviving smallpox. They just so happened to take the pus from a smallpox recovering cow and applied it to an open wound and invented one of the earliest forms of inoculation. Same thing happens to this day, but instead of sticking a needle of a virus into another human, it just so happens we have some immortal cells that can reproduce without dying and infect it and then extract what we need from it. Of course, this method wouldn't work on diseases like bubonic plague. Robert Maxwell, father of Ghislaine. The man was the leading cause of paywalled scientific articles today. Before him, science publishing was relatively open. He helped shape the industry into the cancer on academia it is today. Quite the thing to wake up to. Thanks everyone. For those interested, I found an article that details the events pretty well. The Doctor version is that through use of PR marketing, exclusivity deals, and copyright law, Maxwell through Pergamon Press turned scientific publishing from a relatively non-profit-driven endeavor to a predatory industry that charged institutions out the nose for research they paid nothing for. Check out Alexandra and Sub. They've definitely helped many people who can't access scientific research. Video on Sub. https://www.youtube.com/watch V equals Pizza Success Zelo. Article, https://www.theguardian.com/science/2017/June/27/profitable business scientific publishing bad for sheens. Obligatory reply. Aaron Swartz, a co-founder of Reddit and lots of other cool stuff, made Storie publicly available. I won't spoil it if you don't know how it ends. https://www.youtube.com/watch V equals 9VZ0603UK BTW. If you want a journal article that is behind the Storie paywall, email the author. Most of them are happy to provide it. They make no money off of it anyways and want people to read their research. Their professional email addresses are easy to find. My work is in humanities, not the sciences, but when I've encountered articles behind paywalls that I don't subscribe to, 100% of the time that I've emailed an author, he has gladly sent me the PDF of the article without charge. The writers of those articles want their work out there, so they seem eager to share it. Of course, if it's old, or if you can't find the authors, deceased, etc., it's harder, but it's always worked for me. Purportedly, the unnamed inventor of flexible glass, Vitrum Flexile, brought a drinking bowl made of the material before Tiberius Caesar. The bowl was put through a test to break it, but it merely dented, rather than shattering. The inventor repaired the bowl easily with the small hammer, according to Petronius. After the inventor swore that he was the only man alive who knew the manufacturing technique, Tiberius had the man executed. He feared that the glass would devalue gold and silver, since the material might be more valuable. https://n.m.wikipedia.org/wiki/flexible_glass. I would suggest Andrew Wakefield. His work ileal lymphoid nodular hyperplasia, nonspecific colitis, and pervasive developmental disorder in children has been directly responsible for the mistrust of vaccines, the decline of Western rates of vaccination, and basically telling everybody that there's a boogeyman underneath your bed. He is directly responsible for thousands and thousands of deaths. He's a scientist who made a mistake. Why are you blaming him? It's not that he made a mistake. He had purposely customized the outcomes to meet the hypothesis so that he could get rich selling safe vaccines and diagnostic kits. He poisoned the well that saved so many people just so he could get rich. I have no idea how he can sleep at night. On balance, vaccines may be the greatest human accomplishment of all time. People in developed countries really have no idea how bad disease has been for most of human history, precisely because of the success of vaccines and antibiotics. The vast majority of human deaths for most of our existence has been from disease. And for one brief century, we managed to push it back to the fringes of our awareness. But antibiotic resistance and anti-vaxxers seem determined to bring us back to the old standard. It really is such a huge slap in the face to take a look at this technology that has saved billions of lives, the pinnacle of human achievement, and just say fuck you. This is the answer I would go with right now. I work in the emergency department right now and I am sick and tired of seeing COVID-positive patients without vaccinations. Last week we had a 16-year-old kid had been transferred to a specialist site where the machine has to put oxygen into the blood directly. Not a ventilator but a machine that bypasses the lungs altogether, since they were completely fucked. And when we asked why no one at home was vaccinated, the dad replied that COVID and the vaccine were all bullshit. Fucking good job, Wakefield. Total cunt. Yongle, emperor of the Ming dynasty in China, ordered the fleet of Zheng He, the greatest trading and exploration fleet of the time, to be burned during his reign in the early 1400s. This was the beginning of an era of isolation for Chinese kingdoms, which ultimately led to the collapse of Imperial China, and indirectly to the rise of the PRC. Additionally, the wealth of the world overall decreased as a result of reduced trade with China, and if China had continued exploring, it is possible that they, not Europeans, would have colonized North America, instead of merely maybe discovering it then telling no one as they did in history. It may not be a significant alteration of human progress, but it's one of those events that sets the world in a definitively different direction. It didn't say the Chinese did discover America, just that they might have because it's been theorized that they did and they had the technology. I mean, the Inuit and Siberians have been crossing the Bering Sea in leather kayaks for thousands of years, so the Chinese definitely could have done it too if they wandered up that far. I don't know much about the actual history of that theory, and most of my comments on that are from Wikipedia searches this morning and willingness to believe fun hidden history scenarios that are actually possible. Thanks for all the upvotes. As a caveat, it would have hugely changed naval history too. It would be accurate to say that Europeans and their methods of sailing enabled European-led globalization and colonization. The durability of their designs, relative speed and range were critical developments with a measurable impact on the world. But, really, the Chinese had a totally different system which would have really worked just as well, if not better. European ships were relatively small and had canvas sails, while the great Chinese ships that Zheng He used were massive, and used these kind of folding bamboo sails, ingenious for their strength and manageability. They even had watertight compartments, something European ships didn't even consider using for centuries. Both parts of the world produced ships that could do what the other kind did, while looking extremely different. So, as a maritime history buff, I'm totally fascinated by how things on the high seas would have looked had a Yongle emperor not stifled Chinese naval expansion in the cradle. Edit. Book recommendations are anything by Brian Lavery and Robert Gardiner. The Ming fleets were extremely expensive to maintain, and at that time the Chinese emperor had to deal with significantly greater unrest at home, and piracy and raiding from what would become Japan. It may be helpful to think of the Ming treasure fleets as the medieval equivalent of a space program, something that requires huge expenditures of national wealth to sustain, and something that you would choose to axe if your budget is tighter due to unrest and economic problems back at home. Not necessarily. China was the Middle Kingdom and saw no need for outside colonies or outposts. In their eyes, they had everything they needed, and it was the obligation of their tributaries to come to them rather than the other way around. This is the way it was for most of their history, and the voyages of Zheng He were more of an anomaly, considering it was this attitude of contempt towards barbarians which caused this strained relationship with Western traders and ultimately led to their downfall via the Opium Wars and Boxer Rebellion. The treasure fleets were actually abandoned at the end of Xuan Emperor's reign, not Yongle. Yongle started the treasure fleets, which, speaking of, the voyages were started by Yongle as a way to project power and to live up to the martial legacy of his father, essentially to show off how great the Ming Empire was and obtain recognition as such from other kingdoms. They were not intended for exploration or trade, and indeed traveled along well-known sea routes. Furthermore, China's trade with the outside world did not cease after the treasure fleets were abandoned. They closed down maritime trade because of the misguided notion that no trade means no pirates. It was a huge problem back then. And they were wrong. Piracy actually increased as coastal communities fell into poverty. Furthermore, overland trade was not at all affected by the seamen. Could the treasure fleets have changed into something else more substantial had it continued? Maybe. But then history is full of maybes. Emperor Jiazong of China. This is kind of an obscure story, so let me tell you the whole thing. It was the 12th century. When people talk about how China used to be the most technologically advanced part of the world, this is the period they're talking about. Some historians that they were on the brink of industrializing. Then Manchuria invaded and conquered northern China. The imperial court retreated to the south and declared Jiazong, the emperor's brother, as the new emperor. China's top general Liu, who, according to some records, literally had patriotism tattooed on his back, though that might have been made up by someone who wanted to emphasize how unfair the rest of this story is, rallied his army and defeated the Manchus, and was raring to chase them out. But he gets orders from Jiazong to back down, because he'd rather negotiate. These negotiations end up signing away the north half of China. A few years later, the Manchus invade again. Yu beats them again and pushes all the way back to the old capital, Kaifeng. Then he gets the order to retreat. He responds with a letter saying that he's got the Manchus on the ropes, and he can reconquer northern China in like a month. No, says the emperor, retreat immediately. Eventually, Yu does retreat, but he delays long enough to evacuate the city first, making up some logistical issues as an excuse. At this point, you may be wondering why Jiazong was so reluctant to push an advantage. The answer is that his brother was still alive. The king of Manchuria liked to bring him out once in a while and make fun of him. If you reconquered China, he might liberate the rightful emperor, and Jiazong would be out of a job. As such, Jiazong was actively trying to throw the war, and he interpreted Yu's delay at the end of this war as meaning that he had reached the point of at least considering going rogue. So as soon as Yu got back, he was arrested, and promptly executed on treason on the ground of he might have done something, presumably because the optics on the actual charge almost winning a war we wanted to lose were too bad. People realize that this is bull quickly enough, and there are protests, but Jiazong manages to pin everything on one of his advisors and placated the mob by executing him. So how does this affect the long-term progression of humanity? Well, as I said, China might have been on the brink of industrializing at the time, but didn't have access to enough coal. There are coal deposits in China, but they're all in the north. Second, The man just never really got their internal issues sorted out, and 70 years later, were easily conquered by the Mongols, who then recruited a bunch of disaffected Chinese siege engineers. This essentially removed the one weakness of horse archer hordes: they're not good at taking fortresses, and allowed them to wreck half the world. Had China been united at the time, and had been ruled fairly recently by a guy who had, if you recall, been taken prisoner by invaders from the north, so you can bet the defenses would be fairly well maintained, they probably could not have done this. So had it not been for the malice of this one man, the Mongols would probably never have become the juggernaut they eventually did, and the Industrial Revolution might have happened about 500 years ahead of schedule. Thomas Midgley Jr. In 1921, this guy that discovered that tetrethyl lead could be used as an anti-knocking fuel additive for cars. It satisfied the needs of oil companies at the time, because it worked, was cheap, and was patentable for that purpose. But it was also incredibly toxic, and burning leaded gasoline was hugely pollutive. Eventually, after the creation of the EPA and an oil crisis in the mid-70s, leaded gas was banned in 1996, but the damage was done. Interestingly, the guy didn't even show up for the occasion when the first customer filled up their car with leaded gas ... because he was at home, sick with lead poisoning. Wiki. In the year 1515, Sheikh al-Islam of the Ulama, learned scholars, issued a fatwa that printing was haram, forbidden. As a result, Ottoman Sultan Selim I issued a decree of a death penalty on anyone using the printing press. The fatwa has been attributed as one of the reasons for the stagnation of knowledge, invention and discovery in the Muslim world. At a time when Europe was in the midst of the Renaissance period, it seems that Sheikh al-Islam is a title though, not a name. Bakhtiyar Khilji, hands down. In 12th century there was the world's biggest university in India named Nalanda, where intellectuals from all around the world used to study. Then Turks invaded India under Khilji. They killed almost all the intellectuals and destroyed the university, and they burnt the library. The library continued to burn for 3 months. This has to be by far the biggest loss to mankind ever. Sir Mark Sykes. This man was the British element in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. For those of you not in the know, 100 years ago the Middle East was an area that did have some nations and some more tribal areas, so people were more divided by language and culture, some by religion. France and Britain decided to carve up the Middle East into easier-to-govern territories, but fumbled this task and instead divided the territories on the map over these religious and tribal lines. Not only has this been a main contributing cause of conflict in the Middle East, if you take two opposing or rival groups and then suddenly group them as one country, what do you expect? But said conflicts have then fueled further conflicts again and again. This has then been further used by Islamic extremists as a reason to hate the Western powers, as they were the ones who created this terrible agreement. Even Sykes himself accepted that the agreement's wording should be changed in order to give those countries autonomous rule. What is a little sad is he actually seemed to want to help these regions with the agreement, but just bumbled the whole thing, which has led to most of the issues the Middle East has to this day. Cyril of Alexandria is a pretty good bet. https://n.wikipedia.org/wiki/Cyril_of_Alexandria. He organized murder squads to go around Alexandria killing anyone who wasn't a die-hard Christian. This included nearly every great mind of the era. One in particular was Hypatia of Alexandria, one of the greatest minds in history. She invented a working steam engine nearly a millennia before the first steam locomotive. He is of course considered a saint by Catholicism and the Church of England. Edit. It was Hero that invented the steam engine. Chill y'all, I just woke up to 100 them replies. Her writing did survive, just not intact. Much of it within the treatise of Theon, her father a great astronomer in his own right. Wikipedia is not infallible. One in particular was Hypatia of Alexandria, one of the greatest minds in history. She invented a working steam engine nearly a millennia before the first steam locomotive. Everything about this is wrong. The first steam-powered rotor device was the Aeolipile. It was invented 2,000-ish years ago. https://n.wikipedia.org/wiki/Aeolipile. It was pretty worthless, and Hypatia did not invent it, as its invention predates her birth by centuries. Indeed, as Wikipedia notes, Hypatia has been described as a universal genius, but she was probably more of a teacher and commentator than an innovator. No evidence has been found that Hypatia ever published any independent works on philosophy, and she does not appear to have made any groundbreaking mathematical discoveries.